In the 1960s, there was a Czech psychiatrist named Stanislav Grof who did almost 4,000 LSD experiments, and he published his findings in a book called Realms of the Human Unconscious. In this book, he investigates something called transpersonal psychology, which is a branch of psychology that studies self-transcendence and how it can be applied to spiritual experiences. But transpersonal psychology, in the context of this book, can actually also be used to explain interbeing.
Interbeing isn't really the most widely known idea, so I think it's important that we talk about what it actually is first. Interbeing is a Buddhist self-transcendental philosophy, which means that its main aim is to liberate people from the traditional view of the self. The idea is that everything in the universe is made up of the same stuff, matter, right? And it comes from the same beginning, the Big Bang. So everything ultimately is tied together by this sort of unifying identity. And another name for interbeing is open individualism. And this is a fitting alternate name because the idea of interbeing is oneness, but an important aspect of it is also actually the fact that everyone has their own unique identities and their own quirks while being part of this greater whole. So Grof explains interbeing through his patients' experiences with the different levels of ego dissolution.
The first level that he discusses in his book with transpersonal psychology is looking at the ego distortion. Usually an ego distortion is a distortion of the self where they feel like they are unsure of who they are or where their self is, or where the boundaries of their self start and end. This blurring of the ego is really the foundation for expansions of the ego. It's really just making the ego more malleable, more bendable, and you can expand it to other people or other beings in the universe more easily once you've distorted it slightly. And this is really the first step of interbeing as well. Really the first kind of baby step you can take towards experiencing interbeing is just thinking about your ego, yourself, kind of where it starts, where it ends, and where it might be misleading to think that we're all completely separate, compartmentalized beings. This ego distortion leads to what's called humanistic expansions, which are where the ego distorts and actually expands to engulf another individual. Usually it's someone who's very close to the individual who's undergoing the experience, like a lover or a friend, and they're able to understand and even sometimes feel the thoughts and emotions and sensations of the person that they are expanding their ego upon. And this is really interesting because it's a really simple way to try to understand interbeing. It's really hard to have this universal oneness with the entire universe, but it's a lot simpler to just think of having interbeing with one other individual. These people eventually will get to total human race identification, and obviously this is not something that most people are going to experience unless they're on a very high dose of acid, and you have to be really frying to get to this point. But it does show that the brain does not really have limits when it comes to how it chooses to empathize and how it can relate to other human beings. And it's not outside of the bounds of our imagination to be able to identify with even the entire human race if we really want to. It just might be the case that you need a couple of tabs of acid to get to that point. Another form of identification that these people are feeling is what's called environmental connectedness, where these people are not only identifying during these LSD experiences with other human beings, but they're also able to identify and even empathize with plants and animals. And this is a really important key part of interbeing. A lot of people who take interbeing to heart are usually vegetarians or vegans because they feel this really strong identification with other people and also other animals, including farm animals and plants too. So this environmental interbeing that these people are feeling during these transpersonal LSD experiences really kind of shows a goal that you could be aiming towards with your experience and your journey with interbeing. And a really interesting part of this is people will also feel a sort of micro form of interbeing during these LSD experiences, where they would feel identification even with microorganisms like bacteria. And this is really interesting because, of course, if you have all-encompassing interbeing, you're going to identify with even these really tiny microorganisms. But normally when people think about inner being, they just think about identifying with farm animals and plants and maybe trees and stuff like that. But they're forgetting that there is really these small organisms that are covering everything, including your own body, that you also need to identify with to have this sort of all-encompassing form of inner being. And really looking in on that really micro level, people in these LSD experiences, Grof noticed, would actually experience this sort of connectedness to their cells in their own body, kind of similar to the bacteria, but they're actually understanding that they can have this connection to the individual cells. So this really is an important step of understanding inner being, and a really cool way to think about inner being, because you can think of yourself in a different way than you normally would. Normally people think of their self as a ego or as a internal monologue, but they don't really think about themselves being made of all these individual blocks that build up and eventually culminate to this full self. You're made up of all these cells in your body that themselves don't have consciousness, but it's somehow leading to this self and this consciousness. So this eventually continues to kind of get smaller and smaller on this micro scale until people are even aware of and connecting to, during these really high dose LSD experiences, even the atoms that make up their body. And they're feeling this sort of atomic interbeing where they're connecting with even the protons and the quarks that are making up the universe. But it's also the macro scale, feeling interbeing with everything that is in the universe, including the suns and the black holes and all of the planets. So there's this sort of astrological interbeing, and then there's this microatomic interbeing that these people are experiencing during these LSD transpersonal experiences. So it is a really interesting way to think about interbeing, thinking that I am made up of these atoms that do not have a self are somehow culminating to make myself. And not only that, but there are atoms that are making up everyone else in this sort of atomic soup that is the universe, and we're all just sort of interacting harmoniously with each other. And if you can understand this idea, then you can start to kind of get a hold of inner being as a whole.